Hello, testing? Is that okay? A little bit of feedback somewhere. I'll try it again, okay? That's good. What you don't see is the exercise and coordination that's going on behind the scenes so that those people at home are seeing the same thing. It's not as easy as it looks, I'll tell you that. Okay. Joel, I think we're ready. Am I good to go? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the return of multidisciplinary programs from Northumberland Learning Connection. Before we begin, we respectfully acknowledge that we are located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaties First Nations have been stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and that today remain vigilant over their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people. Tonight, we are delighted to see so many of you here in Cobourg at the Columbus Community Center, and many more joining us by Zoom for the first event in our new program, Alberta Rebranded. Welcome. We first planned to have a program on Alberta in March 2020, 150 years ago. 2 years later, we asked ourselves, is it still relevant? I think you'll agree, as we do, that it is, that a better understanding of all the parts that make up our complicated federation is a vitally important exercise. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome author Aritha Van Herk. She'll be introduced to you by our moderator, Karen Wells. And I'll turn things over to Karen now to do the introduction. Thank you.
This is tricky business, getting everything coordinated, as Betty said. Anyway, how nice to see people, right? It's just like Christmas. Anyway, I just want to add to what Betty was saying, give you a little context, that the idea of this series on Alberta grew out of our series on Newfoundland, which I think a lot of people remember. And it was a wonderful realization that people wanted to know more about distinctive provinces. And of course, Newfoundland you always think of as just a wonderful amount of fun, which of course it is, but there was a good deal more to it than that. So that kind of led to Alberta. And as Betty was saying, because of our complicated confederation, we permit parts of our country to hold on to their individual personalities and to amalgamate those personalities into a nation. And while it never losing the distinctive nature. So it's incumbent upon us to understand more about that. There, that's my pompous speak. So I'll stop that bit now. We did conceive of this series originally as an exploration of Maverick, the idea of, the cow that deliberately wanders from the herd, the person that marches to their own drummer, or when you transfer it to people, and I'll quote Aritha here, she said that on the Alberta sense that a maverick is a risk taker, he's inspired, forward thinking, a unique character, someone who is eager for change. So yeah, 150 years have passed, and we were asking Dorothy and the program committee, has that maverick nature of Alberta changed, or what's it all about? All of which points me directly to our speaker tonight, Aritha Van Herk. And I think it was 15 years ago, something like that, that we met. And we met at an exhibition at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary that was called Mavericks, an Incorrigible History of Alberta. And it was the history of Alberta through 48 different Albertans, each of whom were iconoclastic individuals, ornery in some cases, and just plain different. They couldn't have done what they were doing without being in Alberta. And it really was her exhibit because it came from her writing, the concepts that she raised, and I believe worked very closely with the designers to mount that exhibition. And it wasn't just an exhibition, it's still up, like 12 years later. It's still there. It's part of the definition of Alberta. Aritha Van Herk grew up on a farm in Alberta, was the child of Dutch immigrants, something that resonates with people here, I think, several. And for no logical reason, she decided she would become a writer. It made no sense whatsoever, but that's the nature of being a writer. She benefited, I think, coming along in that near wake of this great move of Canadian nationalism in writers, most of whom we think of as Eastern writers, like the Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, Timothy Finlay, that generation. And then, of course, there are the Western writers, of whom Aritha Van Herk is one of the leaders. She teaches at the University of Calgary, both English literature and creative writing, has been awarded more than one honorary doctorate, won the Seal First Novel Award, in fact, was the first writer, I believe, to win that award, been nominated for the Governor General's Award for Literature, and she is also recognized as a critic, and initiated what I saw described as the genre of ficto-criticism, which I think is kind of a nice thing to explore. And I like this one, that exhibition won at the Glenbow, won the City of Calgary's White Hat Award, which I want to hear more about. Anyway, and Aritha Van Herk is also a member of the Order of Canada. And this is important. Her teaching, her very close work with young Albertans means that she's exactly the right person to talk about the maverick nature of that province and how that's being seen by the next generation, the post-Kenny generation. So I give you Aritha Van Herk.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Try now, Aretha. Okay, hang on 2 seconds. I'm going to get this one set up for you.
Hello. I really very seldom need a mic because I'm used to speaking to classrooms full of students and I know how to raise my voice enough that they pay attention. But as we said, we are aware that people are following us on Zoom. So let me begin again by thanking you for this invitation, for your wonderful organization, Betty, Dorothy, and of course, Karen, whom I've known for years, and also just to Northumberland Learning Connection for your interest and your willingness to continue learning, because I believe that we are all lifelong learners. In some ways, when we think about Alberta as a space and a province, I think I'm more inclined lately to call it a province full of misfits and miscreants than I was perhaps when I wrote Mavericks, but I'll talk about that a little more. I was born very close to the Battle River in central Alberta, the Battle or the Fighting River, which was the loose geographical division between the Cree to the north and the Blackfoot to the south. Now, I don't think they had very many battles, but they were aware of one another's territory, and they certainly followed that. But I also want to acknowledge, and I'm glad to have heard the land acknowledgement here at the beginning, that I now live as a settler Canadian on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot peoples, which includes the Kainai, Siksika, Piikani, and the lands of the Tsuut'ina, Stoney, Nakota, and the Métis Nation 6 of Alberta. Nation 3, sorry. My home, which is the city of Calgary, is called Mukinsis, and it marks the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow rivers. So the question that I get asked more often than any other is, Alberta a maverick province? Is it happy to be a maverick province? Does it revel in that mavericity, or is it actually just a pain in the neck? It is certainly often regarded as the outlier province in Alberta, in Canada, and it has forged a reputation that is both distinctive and in many ways stereotyped, one that we try to evade and nevertheless appear to continue to reinscribe. And that's the doubleness or the duplicity of the maverick world. Someone was asking the other day, what is an Albertan? And it was a phone-in program on the CBC. Somebody phoned in and said, it's pretty simple. It's truck nuts and pump jacks. Now you can see the rudeness there. I prefer the old rusty truck because that was likely working, whereas this truck looks like it's never driven through a hayfield in its life. And the assertion of masculinity, and you don't see them that much, but you see them often enough to be disquieting, is one that actually does give me considerable pause. The pump jacks, of course, are part of the landscape of Alberta, but they are rapidly dying now that different methods of extraction are being used, so that what we once looked at as a marker on the landscape is too beginning to disappear. And of course, Alberta is becoming increasingly aware that oil and gas are no longer so sustainable and we have to diversify. So the pride in pump jacks is diminishing. So the question that you asked me to talk about, what is an Alberta Maverick? It's a question I've been answering for far too long, but I thought I would walk through for you the past, the present, the future, and some Mavericks imagined. Of course, as Karen has already told you, Maverick is an eponym, a word derived from someone's name. It originally meant an unbranded calf, and it comes from a Texas rancher called Samuel A. Maverick. He didn't brand his cattle. No one knows really why, whether he was just too lazy or whether he thought it wasn't worth it. But in effect, unbranded cattle then were called Mavericks. But of course, what many people do not mention is that made them rather available for rustling. So other people could steal them. So I don't know, it seems to be tied to notions of theft, and I will pursue that. The past, of course, resonates with that kind of structure of unpainted wooden buildings hovering on the edge of a coulee with snow melting behind them. But of course, the past of Alberta is indeed resonant and rich. And unfortunately, it's an aspect of my province that not all Albertans really understand or know that much about. The first question, the first aspect of Alberta is its Indigenous complexity. And it has the most complex Indigenous culture that one can imagine. Many, many different families, many different tribes, and it profoundly, in many ways, beautiful aesthetic in terms of its culture, and a very strong sense of identity, so that more and more Albertans have to grapple with the various aspects of our Indigenous culture. And I don't want to say our Indigenous people because they aren't ours. In many ways, Alberta belongs to them, and we, the settlers, belong to them. But Indigenous complexity is one of the elements that people are rapidly taking on and beginning to understand is key and central. Of course, there's a tendency to look at, this is courtesy of the Glenbow Archives, those romantic photographs of a Blackfoot encampment. But that has long since changed. And what you see now are very powerful movers in our political, social, and educational systems. And they are working within the fabric of Alberta and changing it remarkably. And that, of course, is an aspect of Alberta that I can only welcome. But let me take a little trip backward. So, first of all, this part of the country was kind of the big wide open who knew what. And when explorers, fur traders, and settlers started coming, and there was a recognition that there was considerable wealth in the furs of the West, King James handed over this part of Canada, the green graph, to his cousin, Prince Rupert, and he just, in many ways, he owned, controlled, could do anything he wanted with what was called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land itself was just a territory that people were quite vague about, but were keenly aware that it contained a wealth of fur. Minerals they weren't so sure about because they hadn't discovered very many, but they certainly knew how rich the fur was. Of course, the changes to that occurred quickly. Once there was awareness that the United States was interested in getting its hands on Western Canada, Central Canada, what I call Centrals, Upper Canada, realized that it was not to their advantage to let this territory go unaccompanied, let's put it that way. And so at a certain stage, the Dominion of Canada bought Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, they bought Rupert's Land for 300,000 British pounds. Not very much. So in a sense, that whole purchasing of the territory, the deeding of it to Prince Rupert, who was just a favorite of King James, then the selling the Hudson's Bay, controlling it. Is that mine? Okay, you make me relieved because I was worried it was mine. And then subsequent to that, the Canadian government buying it from the Hudson's Bay Company and turning it into the Northwest Territories, which was, of course, subdivided into districts. There's a map of Western Canada from 1894, the districts of the Northwest Territories. You will see that Alberta is only that very small section in the bottom. But that was the beginning of the Northwest Territories' urge for what they called at that time self-governance. They're wanting to be in control of their destiny, because if you are a territory and you must rely on Ottawa to provide you with schools and roads and bridges and healthcare, you are actually in trouble. So various politicians at that time lobbied strenuously to make the Northwest Territories not independent, but to give them provincial rights. So the fight for provincial autonomy, which really took place from 1882 to 1905, was fierce. And it was as well tied to the determination or the interest of Americans in getting their hands on Western Canada. So eventually it came about that, I have to go back to this, that in 1905, the Saskatchewan and the Alberta Acts were decreed. Now, this was not necessarily an outcome that everyone was happy with. All of the parties, it seemed, were dissatisfied. And one of the proposals for provincial autonomy, and this is the one that I am most fond of, was that everyone was dissatisfied, and Sir Frederick Hultain wanted the Northwest Territories to be one big province called Buffalo. To this day, I'm really sorry he did not succeed. I think Alberta would have been kinder and gentler. I think Saskatchewan perhaps would have been richer, although they're pretty rich now. And that if we had been one province, our character would have been more diverse. And I suspect a lot gentler. Sir Frederick Hultain was the man who fought for this. He served for some time as the head of the territorial government in Regina, but when it came to the provinces, he was not appointed as the premier either of Alberta or Saskatchewan. However, I think of him as one of the fathers of Alberta. He is in the Alberta legislature the only person whose portrait hangs there who was not a premier, and he is the only man holding a smoking cigarette, which I think is absolutely stunning. He has a life story that I would very much like to see fictionalized because it's incredible. He had more good and bad luck in strange ways than almost anyone. But this is what he negotiated with Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and he lost. He wanted education to be secular and provincial, but to appease the Roman Catholic Church, separate schools were enshrined in the legislation, in the Alberta Act. Crown lands that Hultain thought should be Albertan were controlled by Ottawa. The CPR's Western tax exemption continued, and most important, mineral rights were still held by Ottawa. All of those were points that Hultain negotiated and lost on. Not just that it would be Buffalo, one big province, but all of these elements. And again, the long shadow of education, because we still do have what we call public and separate schools, both of them funded, but the enfranchisement or the establishment of them within the province has meant that there are all kinds of divisions that continue. So on September 1st, 1905, when Alberta became a province, there is the program. Of course, it took place in Edmonton. That was another fight and gerrymander who was which city would be the capital, Calgary or Edmonton. Hultain was not invited. He was the man who had, in effect, brought about provincial autonomy, and he was not present at that ceremony. He was not present at the ceremony 2 days later when Saskatchewan was celebrated, and in fact, he was virtually erased. And I always, again, wonder what would have happened if he had been put in charge of the province. I think there would have been far less corruption, and there probably would have been greater cooperation. His knowledge of the law and his interest in the future of Alberta was more complex and sophisticated than the subsequent premiers who were brought in to govern. Now, I don't want to dwell on them. I'm sure that you can look up Rutherford and the railway scandal, et cetera, et cetera. Alberta is rife with scandals. As a matter of fact, we appear to relish them. But I did want to gesture to this premier, who was Premier of Alberta from 1925 to 1934, because he was the premier who finally signed an agreement with the federal government transferring control over Alberta's natural resources to the provincial government. And he's the person that we remember for that, which happened in 1930. He's also remembered, not remembered perhaps, for being ousted from office for the first case of sexual harassment of a young woman in one of the most juicy court cases, apparently, that were ever held. And it damaged his reputation so much that he was defeated in the next election. He was also a symbol of the many different political, I don't even know what to call them. I don't want to call them parties that arise out of Alberta, because you start with your basic liberals and conservatives, although Haultain, which is fascinating, wanted Alberta to be a province without party affiliations. Well, good luck with that. That wasn't going to happen. But all of these strange parties kept coming out of Alberta. The CCF was begun in an auditorium in Calgary. It subsequently moved to Saskatchewan for reasons that I'm sure are obvious to you, but it was begun in Alberta because there were very powerful labor movements, very great interest in equality and justice. Brownlee was the head of the UFA government, the United Farmers of Alberta government, which was, again, a complete outlier. It was really in recognition of the grain growers of Alberta, and a party that, of course, did not survive. It was, this is the detail about the Natural Resources Act that enabled the transfer of control over lands and natural resources to the provinces from the federal government. Brownlee was defeated, or the UFA government was defeated by another, one of the strangest parties ever, Social Credit. For the life of me, I cannot, for all the years that I have studied Alberta, its character and its politics, understand why Social Credit was able to sweep in at that time, except for the fact that it was 1935, the middle of the Depression, and they promised everyone $50 a month. Apparently, they were planning to print money, but the federal bank at some point said, no, you can't do that. William Eberhart was a school teacher and a preacher, and our long tradition of religious coloration in leaders, it seems, continues to this day. And that may be perhaps positive, or it may be dubious. I sometimes wonder why, but the power of religion is partly, it seems, what enabled them and also what gave them a kind of oratory bent. You are going to hear from the son of Ernest, the Manning era, who he succeeded Eberhart under, again, the banner of Social Credit, but who was basically conservative. I mean, Social Credit kept the name, but it was governance of fiscal conservatism and social conservatism. The whole control over alcohol, the one of the stories that I find most interesting is the Alberta Censorship Board, which would review every film and decide whether A, it should be shown, B, it should be cut, or C, what ages would be allowed to watch it. And that persisted for quite a long time. So when people talk to you about freedom, very interesting. And of course, he was swept out by Peter Lougheed and the Lougheed era. You see how this is about 10 to 20 year cycles? Lougheed is perhaps the politician that most people know and recognize. And he presided over an era not only of growth, and it was certainly economic growth, which enabled a lot of Alberta's attitude, but of polish, education, and the arts. This was a man who valued education. Under his provenance, the universities grew, more were established, and education was accorded not just prestige, but was treated as if it was going to be the path future for Alberta, the way forward for Alberta. He was followed by Ralph Klein. I'm not going to say very much about him. Again, it is a mystery to me how knowing what people knew about Klein, they would nevertheless vote for him. The last time I saw him, and this was purely accidental because I do not frequent them, was in a casino. And I don't know, maybe he lived there. And then, of course, there were various other conservative premiers who came to kind of cratered. And then we had Jim Prentice, who made a remark to Albertans that nobody listened to and everyone was angry at. But at this point in time, perhaps we should have paid attention to. Somebody said, why do you think Albertans are having such a hard time? Because he was running at the same time as we were having a great downturn. And he said, Albertans should look in the mirror. He was right, of course, but they did not take kindly to that suggestion. And so he was swept out, and Rachel Notley, the NDP, was voted in with a majority, ending 44 years of conservative rule, which is actually astonishing. Even though she lasted only one term, she isn't gone yet. So this is what I started to understand as I was looking all these. The Alberta political philosophy is this: you elect a party in a landslide majority, you bide your time for about 6 months, you get increasingly steamed about what they do or don't do, you get furious and you scream, throw the bums out, and the result is political scrambled eggs. Now, I am not going to opine about what is happening in Alberta to Premier Kenney and his attempts to have his leadership ratified again, but you can see that it kind of follows this pattern, especially the political scrambled eggs. Okay, so Rachel Notley wins. Now, of course, Kenney defeats her, and he is elected in 2019, and he is now in the third year of that. We will have an election next year. Now, what does this have to do with Mavericks, Alberta history? It seems to me that these are reflections of the uneasy nature of the province of Alberta. Its discontents are manifest by the wildest of behaviors, both economic, social, and political. It tends to succumb to boom and bust mentalities, which have a good deal to do with the character. Boom and bust, which follows one after the other, and we have just lived through a bust, and now we're encountering another boom because of the world price of oil, and I am sure we will encounter another bust, and people will not have learned, which is the most disquieting part of Alberta. But of course, it is that boom and bust mentality that reflects Alberta's character. It's changeable, it's capricious, and it's turbulent. Because if you don't have a steady approach, you will frequently find that turbulence is the result. So my theory about Mavericks, Alberta was shaped by Mavericks, men and women who were adventurous, hardworking, and spirited. That has not changed. And when I say that Alberta was shaped by that, I mean right back to the Indigenous people who were themselves adventurous, hardworking, and spirited. And the stories that accompany that Mavericity are stories that are, some of them are so crazy it's impossible to let them go. Some of them are hard to believe. And some of them are as whimsical and as gentle as the prairie crocuses. So there's such a great range. It's very difficult to characterize. If you look at the attraction of Alberta to investment, to immigrants, of course, and land, to religious groups that were promised freedom, and it really was part of the reason that we attracted so many Hutterites, Mennonites, Doukhobors, Mormons, because there was a promise that they could practice whatever religion they wanted to. Except, of course, that did not extend as far to American Blacks who wanted to immigrate. They were given a very hard time, although there are several very old Black communities in Alberta. And part of the attraction of Alberta appeared to be its challenge and its eccentricity. It isn't unlike Saskatchewan or BC, its neighbors, but it is in a sense that it kind of refuses to follow the paths that other people follow. So the present. Right now, it is uneasy, conflicted. Is it a hotbed of populism? I'm not sure about that. Is it populism or is it a kind of recidivist desire to do whatever they want and not obey any rules? Is the disease COVID or boom and bust disease? And what are we seeing a manifestation of anger and grievance mongering? Now, grievance mongering is a wonderful term that I got from the former Speaker of the House of the United Kingdom, John Barlow, wonderful speaker, is one of those elements where you will make a grievance mountain out of a molehill, that you will find a grievance even if you don't have one. And of course, I always go back to that old example of the farmer whose his crop blows away, his dog runs away, his wife leaves him, he's got nothing left, and he shakes his fist at the sky and says, "God damn the CPR." I mean, that is the essence of the grievance mongering that goes on now. I mean, a year and a half ago, it was all about how oil was not being accorded the economic respect it deserved. Now that the price of a barrel of oil is through the roof, I mean, why are we aggrieved now? I guess because, I don't know. Grievance mongering comes out of a strange kind of prickly character, probably closer to a porcupine than anything else. And of course, it's given rise to some more parties. The Wild Rose Party, all kinds of other fringe parties. Kenny presumably united the Wild Rose Party and the Conservative Party into the United Conservative Party. I always have to be careful, but it isn't, as you can see, very united. People are fighting, scrapping. And then there's also this fringe party, the West Federal Party, it claims to be, or the Maverick Party. And it is not a party that I have any affiliation with. They are furious that I have the Twitter handle, and they keep trying to crash me. But the question you want to ask about it, does it advocate for separatism, or is it demonstrating a form of imported American republicanism? And that is one of the aspects that you probably have noticed in the convoy protests and in the Coots blockade, that a lot of the people there are not Canadian. They're coming to us from elsewhere. So Kenny says we're open for business. This is one of his favorite lines. Alberta open for business. What was he? Best summer ever. That was last summer before the COVID wave that shut us all down again. But are we more open for business or less open to nuance? And this is a question that I confront every day. What is our cultural competence? Is it present or is it absent? And cultural competence, of course, is one of those elements that I really want to talk about. The ability to understand, to appreciate, and to interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from one's own. And I don't mean this just as race or religion or sexual orientation. I mean it in a general sense. Is cosmopolitanism, which Alberta has in spades, passed us by because we are so poorly represented and thus read differently from what we would like to be read as? That's a question. I don't have an answer. Calgary is a beautiful city, but you can see that the old and the new compete with one another always, and that is true about Alberta in general. There's a constant kind of push and pull between the past and the future and the present. That desire for a kind of boundless future, I'm afraid rather casual erasure of the past, unless it suits people to call up the past and say we were always hard done by. I don't know, again, grievance mongering, or the present and what it manifests. But here's one example. Today, actually, is the 10th anniversary of the opening of the Peace Bridge, which is this beautiful, I always call it the Twizzler Bridge, designed by Santiago Calatrava, the renowned Spanish architect. 14 years ago, or 12 years ago, I guess, was the height of the complaint. The whole province was going nuts. You're paying $24.5 million for a bridge. How dare you? It's a waste of taxpayers' money. What are you doing? We don't need a bridge. Why don't you just put a normal bridge over the Bow River? On it went. And it wasn't only an argument in Calgary, it was all over Alberta. The bridge, they persevered. The bridge went up. Now, every photograph you see of the city of Calgary and the province of Alberta sports that bridge because it is beautiful. It is aesthetically stunning. There are more pictures of politicians taken on that bridge, more pictures of people getting married on that bridge, more breakfasts in honor of the Legion on that bridge at sunrise on November 11th. That bridge does it, and it is because it is aesthetic and beautiful. And all the discourse, there's another view of it, about wasting taxpayers' money, which is one of our favorite phrases of grievance mongering, has very quietly been swept aside. And so the contradictions inherent in that question of, are we willing to extend ourselves and to commit to a cultural, aesthetic, and sophisticated vision? Or are we always going to say, I don't want to pay any taxes, that costs too much, this costs too much, that costs too much? Which is, of course, a threnody that comes straight from Alberta, is a little lesson that we might observe here. And it's very interesting to me that even those people who were the most strenuously opposed to the cost of this bridge are now going around bragging about it. So it's an interesting change. Once it's there, do you embrace it and believe that it represents you, or do you always resent what it cost? Good question. So the current image of Alberta, is it rough and ready? Sorry about the earlier reference to truck nuts and pump jacks? Is it oil and gas, oil and gas, oil and gas ad infinitum? I don't think it can afford to be anymore, although that is certainly one of the lines that gets used most about Alberta. Does it demonstrate a kind of rampant arrogance? And that often happens when a place has a lot of money. It does show arrogance that isn't always very pretty. Should we be proud of our attitude or our geology? I mean, this is an accident of geology that we are as wealthy as we are. And I really wish people would understand that more. And finally, is Alberta beautiful but intolerant? And that's a question that, of course, we have to continue asking ourselves, because tolerance isn't always evident. But of course, how do we explain the unexpected? The day after he was elected, Naheed Nenshi, first Muslim mayor of a large North American city, born in Toronto, Ismaili Muslim, every one of my Toronto friends emailed me, texted me, phoned me, and said, "How come you've got him? He belongs here, not out there." In fact, he was an absolute Calgarian. He won in a landslide. Now remember, this is a mayor. It's a different level of political and social engagement. Edmonton right now, current mayor of Edmonton, Amarjit Sohi, born in the Punjab of Sikh origin. Current mayor of Calgary now, because Naheed Nenshi has retired, Goti Gondek, born in London, England, but of Punjabi background, immigrated to Manitoba when she was 4 years old. So the image of Alberta as a very white male and very old school figure is being altered right under our eyes. And the reputation of Alberta, even though many people don't pay very much attention to this, is changing, at least internally, if not externally. Well, is the Alberta redneck gone? No, I don't think so. But it is interesting to me that the appellation is picked up often by people who aspire to that rather more than those who actually practice it. 90% of the truckers in Alberta are vaccinated. 95% of them continued to work. They had very little to do with the protest convoy, almost nothing. And somebody said the other day, well, why don't they go out and protest? And they said, because we're too busy working. Excuse me, right? Protest and counter-protest don't work very well. Is the Alberta redneck still there, or is it just hiding? And of course, that's a question that we always have to ask, because that old grassroots intolerance, and not all grassroots movements are intolerant, but that grassroots intolerance can certainly raise its head more than one might suspect. Oh, this is a photograph of the Coots blockade. Yeah, I guess they're now all in court, having a fine time. As a matter of fact, I read one comment from one of the participants in the Ottawa blockade who said, well, I just went because it sounded like it was fun, and now I've lost all my savings, and what am I supposed to do? Of course, my answer to that would be go to school. Okay. Now, there are so many polls about Alberta that I can't resist giving you some of them. Perceptions of Alberta from the outside can be very, different from the inside. So the rest of Canada, this was a Maru public opinion poll with Janet Brown, who's one of the really best pollsters in Alberta and in Canada, as a matter of fact. So the question was asked of those who are outside of Alberta. Alberta is a place where I would feel comfortable living, 50%. Now, this is from about 2 years ago. Alberta is a good place to raise a family, 67%. That probably gestures toward a kind of conservative bias. Alberta is welcoming to new immigrants. 59% thought so. Alberta is a good place for a young person to pursue a career. 67%. Albertans care about other Canadians. We'll see the drop there, 54%. That's not a happy percentage. Albertans are tolerant of others who are different, another 54%. Alberta is a place that's open to new ideas, 56%. Albertans share the same values as myself, 53%. Albertans care about climate change, 47%. And Alberta is well positioned for the economy of the future. Now, when you read, and again, this is a poll of people who live outside of Alberta, okay? So it's not necessarily reflective of the attitudes of Albertans. But when you read that, you realize that our reputation it's not black, but it's kind of gray. Because, of course, the issues of economy, climate change, sustainability, and the future of this country, Canada, is, I would hope, one that every province would be equally invested in. Now, we all know about the failings of polls. We understand their limitations, but that one certainly does give me pause. So where is the disconnect between the way Albertans are regarded and the way that they regard themselves? Is it rearview mirror driving? Are we driving looking in the rearview mirror? Is the key conflict between resource development and environmental protection? Well, when Corb Lund stands up and says you're not going to mine the eastern slopes of the Rockies anymore, and he stands for both country singers and ranchers, when you've got the country singers and the ranchers against you, you're in big trouble in Alberta. So what has happened? Is the disconnect in a kind of incendiary agitation? And I made reference earlier to the whole influence of Republican America. War rooms. I'm sure you've all heard about our infamous war room that appears to be waging war on strange enemies like the cartoon movie Bigfoot. Yeah. Bigfoot presented oil and gas in a negative light. So don't get me started. Is the disconnect the attrition of doctors, nurses, education, and post-secondary education? Because there's a severe attrition. And the final one, which is really undergoing a battle royale right now, curriculum revision of the kindergarten to grade 6 curriculum. And if you think that Albertans aren't invested in education, you should see the war about that one. It is enormous, and it isn't just teachers or the parents of children. Public versus private. This, of course, is one of the elements, and I've only chosen at random one example, but the privatization as an answer to whether or not we have sufficient medical care, whether our schools are appropriate, whether any of the other aspects of our standard of living is an ongoing question. And of course, Premier Kenney is very much in favor of privatization, even though he pretends that he is not. And this is just one example. His Minister of Education says, we're exploring the concept of a charter campus model where several public charter schools could be housed in a single facility. She was promoting clearer pathways into post-secondary education. Now, the whole point of a charter and the distinction, public, charter, or private schools, is that charter schools are now, of course, being called charter schools, but are masquerading as private schools. And so if parents are concerned about their children getting an adequate education, they will often pay to send them to private school, because public schools, of course, their funding has been severely curtailed. Oh, this is bad. You probably can't read that. Facts. Okay, these are facts. Much of what I have said before is speculation. Much of it is opinion, but these are facts. 568 physicians left the profession in Alberta in 2021, including 140 doctors who left the province. By comparison, 87 left in 2020 and 54 left in 2019. And this is very largely, some people say it's all because of COVID. No, it's the fact that the government has been in a war with healthcare. The cuts to education and the introduction of the three-tiered system, public, charter, private, that I mentioned before, this as well is going on. The draft K-6 curriculum, which is straight out of the 1950s. It's been rejected by most readers because it is not age appropriate. The other day, they were arguing about this on the radio, and Kenny said the curriculum did not mention all of the people who died in World War II. And of course, this is not true. Every school has a huge recognition, especially around Remembrance Day. Economic pressures, there are huge increases now to the cost of natural gas, electricity, and insurance. The cap on automobile and house insurance was removed by the Kenny government, and now they've all gone through the roof. A new funding model for post-secondary education, which is an outcomes-based system, means that the increases in tuition for students have been extreme. And as a matter of fact, here's another fact, $25 million reduction to the University of Calgary's operating budget, which is minus 6% since 2019. The University of Calgary's operating budget has been reduced 18% since 2019, and by the year 2024, it's expected to be almost a 40% reduction. Post-secondary education is not valued. And of course, the counteraction will be, well, we're trying to persuade people that they should have useful jobs, they should join the trades. Of course, the trades are also experiencing cutbacks, so that it isn't only universities, but schools like NAIT and SAIT. So what we're developing in opposition to, I'm aware of the time, to Lougheed starting universities is a very deliberate clawing back of them. And if I understood this, I could explain it to you. I can only explain it by saying that it seems that there's a great fear of education in the new right. So, label aside, grievance mongering, vaccine uptake, Coots blockade, hatred of taxes. You say the word tax in Alberta and somebody will spit at you, especially if you say the word sales tax. Climate change, what do we do with it? Misinformation, education. These are all aspects of the province that right now are in huge turmoil. And they are aspects that are at times not pretty, at times justified, but indeed, there's a lot of argument about this. There is certainly no declaration that we are unified about those questions. And so I would ask, is this the new Mavericity? I wrote Mavericks 20 years ago. What's happened since then? Are we Mavericks still? Do we still practice curiosity and innovation, or are we more interested in practicing recalcitrance? And as I said before, war rooms and moribund pipelines, hyperbolic indignation. When the agreement that had been reached between Prime Minister Trudeau and Mr. Singh was announced, Kenny's words were, "This is disastrous for Alberta." And that's very strong language. A disaster is serious. Is this a place for toxic masculinity's last stand? I don't know. What do we do with the brain drain? Now, one more report, and I give this to you because it's very recent. The Canada West Foundation did a report on Alberta youth mobility, and its findings were very interesting. Make Alberta great again is not a mantra. Mavericity isn't enough. And one value that young people from within and outside of Alberta agree on is that they work to live, not live to work. And so they are leaving in huge numbers. Since 2016, for the first time since 1988, more youth aged 15 to 29 moved out of the province than moved in. We were at one time one of the youngest provinces. Over the next 5 years, Alberta's net out migration of youth was 1,100 roughly per year, but we were losing young people very quickly. And when I ask my students, are you going to stay? They'll say, no, I'm going. Alberta had 9% fewer 25 to 29-year-olds in 2021 than 2016. And combined with our aging population, this trend of more young adults leaving the province than moving to it is troubling. It's very troubling, especially because they are, of course, the innovators. They are the ones who are going to figure out how to move us from a resource-based economy to a more diverse economy. Why? The questions they were asked were this: career opportunities, safe and clean places to live, affordability, inclusivity, social identity and place. They don't want to be identified with Alberta. Traffic and transit. Young people don't drive, they take transit. Tax rates. Alberta claims to have very low tax rates, but by the time you pay all the fees that are in place, I'm not sure how far ahead you are. Politics, of course. Vibrant downtown areas is what they look for, of course, and nightlife and sports. So, is Alberta capable of being home to the new Mavericks? We have to deserve the label. I'm not sure it's a question of populism, or is it a question of recalcitrance? And what is the role of education? And how much do we value cosmopolitanism? Now, I'm not going to leave Alberta. I had many opportunities, and I've decided to stay. But my anecdotal observations are very different from what I see reported in the press. This is your typical Alberta classroom at the University of Calgary, and what you will note is that it's probably about 1/3 white and 2/3 Canadians who may be first, second, third generation Canadians, but it's incredibly diverse. And that diversity, of course, is going to be a strength, and I hope will combat some of the out-migration. The University of Calgary coat of arms, but we have a powerful Indigenous movement. Oh, the other one is gone. Oh, too bad. Because the Indigenous students have put together an alternative coat of arms, which instead of the bull has a buffalo, back to the province of Buffalo. The new Mavericks, they're not brash and combative. I would say that they are interested in increasing diversity, keen awareness of social justice, keen awareness of Indigenous issues, keen awareness of environmental issues, a very marked tolerance of sexual choice, and in day-to-day demonstrate a sensitivity and consideration of others that is much greater than any generation I've seen. And I've been teaching for more than 30 years, so I've had a chance to observe that. And so my conclusion, Alberta is no colony. We're a province, I would say, in a country that is remarkably united despite an unwieldy geography. And focusing on disaffection and disagreeing in order to be disagreeable, I would say only distracts from a future where we have the opportunity to be leaders of an innovative future. And that, of course, is what I prefer to believe and what I will work to believe. But I hope I have, to some extent, exploded some of your ideas about truck nuts and pump jacks, and that you can imagine that we are living at a changeable time, and Alberta is particularly in a changeable moment that I hope they will embrace for the better. Thank you.
All right, I think we sort of have to play games with the microphone here. Thank you, Aritha, so much. Thank you so much. Exploding images, etc. But let me ask you, why, if everything is changing so much, does Alberta still have this ostensibly maverick political presence? We have to share.
If I could figure that out, I would be a rich woman. Politics in Alberta are very interesting, and I'm not a politician, so this is anecdotal, and I'm not a member of any political party. Okay, I will tell you that right now. I have voted probably for every party over my lifetime. But I think that there's a strange embedding in Alberta. So I once had a really big argument with a woman because I said, Rachel Notley is doing a really good job. And she's basically a progressive conservative. That's the way she conducted herself when she was the Premier of Alberta for that 4-year period. And she just looked at me and said, she's doing a good job, but she belongs to the wrong party. And I thought, you would vote for a hay bale if it had the slogan conservative on it. And I don't understand that, because if we are so interested in evaluation and we evaluate people on the basis of how well they perform, why does this persist? I don't know. But discontent, grievance mongering, it's going on in Alberta right now. I don't know what's going to happen with my premier. He still is the premier.
Do you have any sense, and I won't belabor this, of percentage of in an election, what percentage of people vote? Is it worse or better? I think, what are we at? 56% in the last election, I think?
When Rachel Notley came in, it was a very low percentage. I do know that, because I think that Albertans think that Conservatives are going to win even if they don't vote. And so they wake up the next morning and they're all surprised. And so then in the next election, they got the votes out. I think it's roughly 48, but again, I don't want to guess.
No, fair enough. Is this working, Joel? Yeah, yep. Okay, sorry. All right, questions. Nobody has any, oh, come on. Yes. Oh, yes, please, speak. Okay. I'm going to repeat the question for those people in Zoom land. Can you talk about the distinction between the rural-urban divide? Let's start with that.
The rural-urban divide is, again, one of those elements that I think has been blown out of proportion. There definitely is a difference in culture between the cities of Alberta and the communities around, but the cities' adamant support of agriculture, and they do support agriculture rather strenuously, I think means that divide is lessening. I think it was greater when there was a greater disparity of prosperity, between the cities and the rural regions. But now that is shifting to some extent. And so again, it really, every time I hear a politician say, Alberta or Canadians are divided, I think you're articulating a sentiment that I'm not sure I see or that I encounter. I don't think we're as divided as we are told we are. But remember that those can become self-fulfilling prophecies in a strange way. And certainly the uptake, for example, of vaccinations in the rural areas of Alberta was far less than in the cities, for example. But it wasn't non-existent. And that's also probably part of because they're not encountering as many people all the time. But if you go back to what I said about Alberta welcoming all those immigrants, which included all those interesting religious groups, Mennonites, Hutterites, Doukhobors, Mormons, on and on we go. Many of those religious sects have continued to demonstrate a very particular resistance to science and education. But I would not say that it's 50-50 in Alberta. I would say that that's about 10%. But again, I'm not a statistician. I follow polls by respected people, but
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Wayne, sorry. Here comes Joel with another microphone.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Is there a division between young people and older people?
I think young people are, and is this specifically Albertan? I think young people are disheartened.
Which is why they're leaving.
They're leaving, but they're disheartened everywhere. I mean, are facing a climate crisis, economics. I mean, they can't imagine buying a home. Now, imagine if you're a young person growing up in Toronto, I'm sure they can't even afford an apartment the size of this lectern, right? So I think that the concern of young people, some of whom I've heard them say, well, I'm the last generation before the world just goes. But at the same time, I also see an incredible, and again, remember, I see mostly university students. So they're ambitious, they've got a relatively good education, and they are interested in education. I see in them a real resilience and flexibility. They're nimble. They know how to turn their interests into work. And they actually really give me hope because they're actually amazing. So yeah, if you put one of them up against an oil and gas person who every time he sees a pump jack thinks dollar signs, yeah, there's a division. But they're more interested, I think, in how do we work with this to make it different. Most of the engineers who graduate from the University of, most of the environmental engineers who graduate from the University of Calgary are hired by oil companies to work on environmental sustainability. Most people don't know that, right? Because we think of it as, okay, if you're an oil and gas engineer, you're just going to work on extraction. But that's no longer the case. And I think that it is the young people of Alberta who are driving that. And that gives me a lot of optimism. But yeah, I'm not sure whether Mr. Manning is going to show you photographs of all the political meetings. But if you look at, for example, the Mavericks party, everyone in that room is a white male of a certain age.
So it's the Trump constituency. Yeah. Can I just ask you one thing, that you have spoken tonight about basically Mavericity leading to something that isn't too positive. What about, if you go back historically, is it simply romanticism to think that some of the Mavericks that came to Alberta led to good things?
Oh, they did indeed.
So give me some examples.
Okay.
And I know you're talking about the famous five tomorrow, right?
I mean, the famous five and many of the innovations that occurred. I mean, now I'm going to forget what it's called, the farmer who invented the plow so that the earth didn't blow away. I mean, there's so many elements that are very, very positive. But the aspect of Alberta that I think enabled that positive Mavericity was its willingness to embrace everyone. So about 10 years ago, a woman I know who just moved to Calgary, she said she was keen on the opera, and she said, do you think I can volunteer for the opera? I said, of course you can, just go and ask them. And she said, but if I were in Toronto, I'd have to have been around and waited for 40 years. And
Have to have a certain social position.
well,
right?
I don't know
Yeah.
about that, but obviously time. And of course, the minute you walk in the door at a place like that in Calgary, they say, do you want to do the work? Okay, you're on. And it is partly that notion of, you want to do the work, we welcome you with open arms. And that's the work in every way. There's a very powerful sense, and I don't think it's meritocracy, but of, if you want to join us and pitch in, yes. And of course, perhaps we saw it most obviously in the Fort McMurray fires and in the flood in Calgary, both of which were huge natural disasters. The Fort McMurray fires, everyone in the province pitched in to help those people and to make sure that they, had a place to stay. And I'm not sure about the rebuilding efforts. I think that's another issue, but very complicated provincial work to make that happen. The same was true in the Calgary flood. After the flood, Nenshi, this is a very funny moment, asked Calgarians, anyone who wanted to go and help people dig out their basements, which were full of mud, could they come to the McMahon Stadium, which is a football stadium? And I guess he thought he would get 2,000 people. Well, he got 20,000. And he's out on the radio saying, can you bring us some boots and some rubber gloves? So there's a strange kind of participatory positivism.
Disaster often does that. I remember 9/11 and being right down at the border as far as you could go. And the place was absolutely full of people who wanted to dig stuff out. And that's New York, But I take your point. It's also characteristic of any younger society where roots do not run deep. I mean, BC, same phenomenon. Anyway, enough. Yeah, Joel?
A question from the Zoom audience. How can Alberta move past the boom bust mentality?
I'm tempted to say pretend it's not happening, but I think what's more important is for Alberta and Albertans to recognize that we have the diversity tools. In fact, if we can persuade the younger generation not to leave, they have all of these ideas for diversity, sustainability. In fact, the tech sector in Alberta is very successful. The wind and
Green
energy sector is growing by leaps and bounds. The local food culture is just going crazy. And that's in alliance with the agriculture question that was raised before. So can we move past it? I think what we have to do is just pretend it's not there and start doing our business.
So diversify the economy, if you talk in those terms.
Well,
Yeah.
Peter Lougheed said that long ago, but every time we turn around when the price of oil goes up, then all of a sudden everybody starts leaning on it again. It's become a kind of weird cane for us, or crutch, if you will. But we've got to, the oil companies themselves are divesting themselves of it. And they're leaving. They're saying, wait a minute, we realize what's happening is that dependence on natural resources is changing.
Question, yes, please. Hang on, man behind you first, Peter, and then it's your turn. Okay, Joel, thank you.
Is there any greater uptake about amongst the youth about bringing in a provincial sales tax rather than the older generations? Like any further acceptance, or understanding of how equalization payments are actually calculated?
Does anybody ever want another tax? I mean,
And this is my issue about education. Somebody said that the punishment for the convoy people should be that they should be sent to study the Constitution for a year and they would understand. The word tax just makes Albertans crazy. I don't know why, because you're absolutely right. They don't know how equalization works, and they don't know that a sales tax would be positive. And every time you've heard it, it's Trudeau's fault that we have more taxes. This happens over and over and over again. It's partly because the word Trudeau, it stands in for a swear word in Alberta, okay? We might as well be saying all of the 4-letter words, which is almost irrational. And it goes back to his father, and I don't know.
Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark. All of that.
Something
yeah.
like that.
National Energy
But
Plan.
in the younger generation, there is a keener awareness that a sales tax might alleviate some of these issues, and especially because they are the ones who are working so hard at all these horrible gig jobs and who suffered from the COVID closures most strenuously. And they really do. For example, the new childcare agreement, most young people were absolutely in favor of it, even if they didn't have children. So there's a very powerful sense that we need a culture that has a greater sense of belonging and inclusivity.
Peter, you had a question. Betty's coming with the microphone.
Thank you. I'm very enjoying your talk this evening, but our granddaughter is teaching high school in Calgary.
Oh.
And she came with an interesting anecdote to us last summer. She said, you wouldn't believe it, I was in, and I mentioned to some of the teachers, other staff members, I heard this on CBC, this really interesting program. And they all said, well, you're from the East, aren't you? You know, and so when I look back in Alberta and I think of the CPR and how it was granted privileges, and I look at Aberhart and his position, and then Manning, of course, and except for perhaps Lockheed and Notley, the way to succeed is to be against Central Canada, and someone like Kenny gets elected almost grieving about how we've been treated so badly. Yet you're saying tonight that there's really a lot of change going on, and perhaps there is, but it still seems to be the way to succeed is to say it's us against them. Would you say that's a wrong interpretation, or?
No, I don't think it's a wrong interpretation. It's a groove that has been worn into a cow path that people will repeat. If you're going to blame someone, you will almost always blame other than yourself, which is why Jim Prentice's comment, look in the mirror, people were enraged at him. That is the comment that lost him that election. There's no question about it. And because, of course, he was a progressive conservative, he would have been quite a bit, I think he would have been
Progressive.
more to the left. Yeah, let's say that. But there's a and this is the part of Alberta I don't like, that recalcitrance. It's somebody else's fault and we're all hard done by. And here we are driving these massive toys, whether they're boats or who knows what. And we're mad when we get a recession, the price of oil drops and we lose the big boat, or we lose the skidoo, or we lose the truck. And I think this is so illogical. And I think there is a tendency to do that. But I also think it's waning now. Of course, maybe I'm just being optimistic. I am an optimist, and I'm choosing to stay because I really believe that it is also a place with limitless future. It's a beautiful province, and one of the elements that we, I think, forget is its greatest asset is its beauty. Its aesthetic beauty is stunning. And people don't think of that as an asset. They think of it as, oh, well, that attracts tourists, or no, I believe it gets into your bone marrow and it lives there, and that becomes a part of your performance of place. But that's a romantic writer speaking, not a politician.
One more question. Yeah, thank you. Is there one more question? Yes, thank you. Betty, over.
I'm just commenting on your slide about the doctors leaving and various other professions leaving. And I was just wondering if, I don't know if it was your implication that they're dissatisfied with maybe the culture, social aspect, politics of the province. But in my mind, sometimes I think about the fact that they're very fiscally conservative in Alberta. And still to this day they are. When Lougheed was in, he started the Heritage Trust Fund, which was proceeds and from the sale of oil, in recognition of the boom and bust economy, so that in the good times or in the bad times they'd have something saved up, like a cushion. And I think a lot of good came out. It disappeared at some point, and then
Ralph Klein, I think.
well, no, the thing is, when Klein came in, he was the one who said, we're going to get ourselves back into a good position financially. And he cut, like, painful cuts. People were bleeding. The cuts were so painful. Like hospitals didn't have any budgets, and schools. And Albertans, they're so socially or fiscally conservative, they were willing to put up with that pain. And even though they complained and it was painful, they put up with it. Do you agree? Until they got out of that hole. And that's why they loved Ralph Klein, because he helped get them out of that hole. I don't know, that's my impression. So I'm wondering if they don't have the budgets right now. I know a doctor, I was just talking to her, and she's from Alberta, and she said they just don't have any budgets in hospitals. And there's doctors, she knows of 6 neurosurgeons that are out of work because they just can't, there's no budgets in hospitals to hire them. And they
Aretha,
have
do you
no
wanna-
choice but to leave.
Sorry.
So I was wondering if that maybe plays into some of the aspect of them leaving.
Indeed, it does. I mean, some of it is that they were, there was a really antagonistic relationship with the government and with the Minister of Health for many. The anecdotes are wild, and I won't beguile you with them. But there is that. But there's also, every time they say, oh, we have 6 more beds, but they have nobody to take care of people in them. And some people, and this isn't me because I'm averse to conspiracy theories, say that there's a deliberate attempt to make the healthcare system crater so badly that then we will bring in private care and that will be what the government wants. I mean, I don't know. I'm not privy to those kinds of, I really don't know. I'm not a politician and I'm not a statistician, but I do know that the medical profession, nurses, doctors, everyone, and they all just got a very severe cut. Who are the people, respiratory therapists?
Yeah.
They just got a cut to their salary of something like 14%. Now, these are the people who are working with COVID and post-COVID sufferers, because if you've been intubated, that's the worst part of your long-term effects. So why? I don't understand. I just think there's a very antagonistic relationship between healthcare, education, and the current government. Now, the whole question of the Peter Lougheed and the wonderful Alberta Heritage Trust Fund, it's there, but it hasn't grown because it wasn't invested in, and they should have been investing in it. I mean, I never could figure out Ralph Klein. He was so curious. And then I think he was, sorry, we are going over time. He was the canniest person when it came to the media. So he gets, sorry, I really am paraphrasing, forgive me, I don't want to tell potted stories. He gets really drunk, he's passing the homeless shelter, he gets out, he throws, I don't know, loonies at somebody and says, get a job. And the next day, of course, the press is all over it. And he just gets right out in front of it and says, folks, I have a problem. I have an alcohol problem and I want you to sympathize with me and help me, and I'm going to get over it. And
Smart move, get out in front of
very
it.
smart. He was so good at that every ordinary person thought that when he said folks, he was talking to them. Now,
We have a premier here who uses that word too. Yeah. Betty's giving me a look, which I think means we have to stop.
it's a wonderful place to end.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again. Betty, are you going to wrap stuff up? I just want to say that I loved your truck. When I went to Calgary at some point, I was picked up by a guy in a truck and the bumper sticker said, support the West Ball, a cowboy. Well,
Well, there's the other one, save a horse, ride a cowboy.
I can see we're ending on a good note here. Aritha, thank you for laying the foundation for our exploration of the Maverick province, if we can or even want to still call it that. Aritha will be back tomorrow to tell us the story of the Famous Five, a group of stalwart Albertans who challenged what it means to be a woman in the eyes of the law. So join us, if you can, back here in this room at 10 o'clock for a seminar-style chat. Next week, it's time to debate the Alberta economy in more detail, and a great debate it will be. It's called Bubbling Crude, What's Next? We've got a moderator who's well-known in the industry. His name is Markham Hislop. We have a panel. I won't tell you their names because you may not know them, but one of them you will. I think Danielle Smith, who was the Wild Rose leader. So that should be a terrific group of people who know the ins and outs and the good and bad of the oil industry. So as always, we say our program committee is ahead of the game with the attack on Ukraine and the instability of world oil. The question of what's next for this event is bang on. So this one next week will be only Zoom. Tomorrow we're here, but next week's Zoom. So please register and let your friends know too. So before we go, Aritha's books are available in the back of the room. If you want to speak to the fellow from Furby's, please do. And one last thing, I'm going to ask one of our board members, Peter McLaughlin, to tell me who the 3 winners are of the You Get the Whole Series for Free Because You Came Tonight contest that you were all entered into. Okay, thanks, Peter. Oh, I have to pick them. Okay, sorry, we're going over time, guys. This will be quick. And these are not board members, right?
They're not board members.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay, Richard Holland.
Oh.
Thank you. Betty Gormley. Yay. And last but not least, Linda Nickel. Yay. That's great. Thank you again, Aritha. Thank you, Karen, for an eye-opening presentation, and we thank our audience for joining us tonight. Good night. Please fill out your survey, and if you're on Zoom, stay on for a few seconds to do that. Thank you.